And I think that's another thing that I'm really conscious of when I'm writing, is trying to think, this isn't about how I react or how I think someone should react. It's about how do I think this particular character react, given their background, what's happened to them, their age, their relationships. Like, what do I think would be maybe the course that they would follow? And that's different for everybody, really.
Welcome to Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is Jane Harper, who is joining us from Australia, where it is tomorrow. And I always love when we talk to people in Australia and New Zealand, because we know tomorrow will come. And these days, I feel like so much is unsure. I'm glad to let her have her tell us it is there. We're going to be talking about her latest thriller, which is called The Survivors. And welcome, Jane. So nice to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here.
So tell us about The Survivors. I confess this is the first Jane Harper that I've read. There are 3 others, everyone. I'm way behind. We'll get into that later. So tell us about The Survivors, where I caught up to you.
Well, welcome. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you have caught up. That's so great. So The Survivors is an Australian mystery, which are the kind of books that I write. It's set this time along the rugged coastline of Tasmania, which is a small state here in Australia. And it's set in a kind of a tiny seaside community. So there's lots of small town intrigue and secrets to be uncovered. It follows the main character, who's a guy called Kieran Elliott. He's a young father, and he's returned to his hometown, still burdened with like guilt and grief over some actions that occurred when he was a teenager. But he comes home to help out his aging parents, and he's barely arrived when a body is discovered on the beach, throwing his whole community into turmoil.
And it's just like, welcome home. Like, look, you're here.
Right.
What happened again? Yeah. I'm going to start with setting, because I know that setting is very important to you. And the book is set up in Tasmania, which I now know, after looking on a map, is south of Australia, and it is west of New Zealand, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
I had to do the map study this morning. I feel like I need to take geography class today with Jane Harper. Tune in, Carol. So what made you set this one in Tasmania? I know that location is very important to you.
Yeah, I mean, the location is something I think about really early on when I'm thinking about the very kind of initial idea. I'm thinking about what would be the setting that would kind of really support this story. So I wanted to set this one in a coastal area. There are a few choices. I mean, Australia has a lot of coastline, a lot of it like really varied, from like kind of like real sort of tourist surface beaches down to things like the kind of the more rugged sort of coastline around Tasmania. And I knew Tasmania sort of felt like a really natural choice. I'd been there a few times, on holiday and for work and things. So I knew it to some degree. I knew the kind of the landscape was exactly what I was looking for. It has that kind of very sort of raw but like really beautiful sort of seascape setting. It has a lot of those really small communities that rely heavily on tourists during the summer, and then the tourists kind of leave, and it's just a sort of skeleton local population left. I do like writing books that are set in a little bit of an isolated kind of location, and Tasmania, it has, because it's an island, it has that kind of already that kind of natural advantage of being a little bit cut off, from the mainland, and also it has quite a low population for the area. So all those sort of things, I think, kind of really ticks a lot of boxes, and I made like a really easy choice for where I wanted to set the book.
Yeah. Now, how far is Tasmania from Melbourne? Like a flight of how long? Like
hours? So it's not that far. So when I went on, I always go on a research trip, and this time I've got 2 kids. I've got a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old who at the time were 3 and 0. So for the first time ever, I took my kids, my husband, on our research trip, and actually for once as well, this was actually quite easy to get to. So me and my baby flew over, and that was like a 45-minute flight. It was nothing. And my husband and my daughter took the ferry, which was an overnight crossing, and they took the car and they went on a boat trip, and then we met them in Tasmania. So there's 2 different ways to get there, and it's pretty easy both ways. So it was really nice to kind of be able to do that, with the family. I guess that was a bit of a different experience.
Was the baby contributing any dialogue that you used in the book? Because there's a baby in the book. I'm like, were you writing scenes?
Yeah, I mean, there is a baby in the book. So Kieran Elliott, the main character, he has a 3-month-old daughter called Audrey, and I knew really early on I wanted him to be a new father, because I think a big part of his sort of his character, I guess, is reflecting on like years gone past, but from this different perspective. And I think there's very few things that give you such a different perspective than new parenthood. And I remember when I had my first child, it really does change your life, in every way. And everybody tells you that, but until you really experience it, it's hard to fully grasp how much. And I wanted him to have that kind of sort of jarring feeling, I guess, of things being completely different. So then by sort of, I guess, lucky happenstance, I had my own baby who was the same age as Kieran's baby. Maybe that's not so much of a coincidence, I don't know. But when I was down there in Tasmania, so I had this 3-month-old of my own who was kind of strapped to my chest while I kind of walked along these beaches. So my son, I think, very heavily kind of contributed to that character of baby Audrey.
You definitely understood what carrying the baby felt like. I can drive that screen very, very easily as they're squirming around, So it's set in Evelyn Bay, which is this fictitious town, but I completely see it. Like, these are the people, they're there in the off season. They're very, very close to one another. I know Tasmania brought something to the story, but so did this small town, this very small town. Is it like any one place you visited, or is it just that quintessential vacation town that's abandoned usually most of the year?
I always try and really hard to, fictionalize the places that I go. I think that's really important when you're writing fiction, especially fiction about small towns and communities. I don't think it's fair to use real places like that if you're going to then fictionalize every event and character in it. But what I also try and do is really pick out those specific kind of things to the region that make it feel like it is a real place, to people who are familiar with the region, and also people who aren't as well, so they can ideally picture it. So what I do, I go to like a lot of, I spend a bit of time in the region. I go to a lot of different places that are kind of, I know, geographically similar to where I want to set the book. And then it's about kind of cherry picking, I think, those elements that will ring true while still allowing me to make it a completely fictional place.
No, I felt like I was seeing the place. I felt like I was knowing where they were all going to eat. And when the place closed down, I was like, oh, what are they doing now? Where are they walking the streets? It was very, very vivid. Was it fun writing them into a place where both Kieran and Mia had grown up? Because they both, they're coming back to a place, which is kind of always odd when you go back to a place where you grew up. And I haven't lived in, we lived in a house for 14 years. When I go back, it's like, I lived here. Like, this doesn't feel the same way. So what's it like? Was it like writing them going back?
Yeah, I agree. I always find that on a personal level really interesting, that feeling of going back to revisit somewhere that you have lived before, and especially somewhere you knew really well, and you go back, and I think there's nothing that quite kind of crystallizes that passage of time than going back to a place where you're so familiar and seeing things differently, and you realize like how much things have changed, and inevitably over the years, as you get older and you gain a bit of maturity, and you see things from a little bit of a different perspective, how things, particularly I think in Kieran's case in the book, how things that you absolutely held to be true and you never really question, when you go back with a slightly different view of the world, suddenly things do start to shift a little bit. And I think that's something I think a lot of people have experienced in various ways. And that's always something that's really, really interested me. So yeah, that was that was an element I really enjoyed kind of bringing out with that story.
Yeah, the going back. And it's also, he starts to see his parents differently. He thinks of things about his father from years ago, and his father is barely communicating now. And every once in a while comes out and says something that actually sounds clairvoyant to a situation that's going on. And it's, what is he really saying? What is he really understanding? It's a big going back. Guilt also plays a very big part in this book. It haunts many of your characters, and you take us inside their heads and into these past haunting moments. So talk to us a little bit about guilt and your characters, because a lot of them are.
So that's right. Yeah. And I think, I one of the things that really interested me about writing as well is I write sort of crime mystery books, but often I guess the mystery at the heart is more the catalyst for what happens next. And that's kind of the thing that really interests me, is how when something happens in a community, how that ripple effect just, can affect so many people in many different ways for years. Like, I used to be a journalist. I was a print journalist for 13 years before I wrote my first book. And that was always the thing of all the stories I wrote that has always stayed with me, is how, an event happens, good or bad. And so often I found myself thinking, like, I wonder what what these people will be doing in 5 years' time. Like, how is this going to, whether they like it or not, this is now that the course of their life has changed. And so that kind of element of, grief and guilt and, regrets over Kieran's father and his relationship with, with him sort of having deteriorated really beyond repair because of his father's, his illness. I think that was something I really wanted to get right. So as well as doing the on the ground research trip, I also do a lot of research around the themes that start to emerge. So for this one, I spoke to a clinical lead advisor from a mental health charity here called Beyond Blue, who's really, really helpful and gave me a lot of advice about everything from how trauma can affect people, particularly like kind of mental health around young people, what kind of advice they're offered, how sort of big, how well they take it, I guess, generally, and what sort of the different sort of paths that people tend to follow when something happens to them that lingers. So that was like a really, I think, important part, because I think when you're going to delve into these things, you want to do them sensitively and accurately, hopefully.
And it's Sean at one point goes out on the same water as where his brother did. And they say, like, how can you do this? Like, how can you go out to the same place where your brother died and just like not, think that much about it? And he said, I'm in a bubble. I sort of draw a circle around it. I keep it all there and try to carry on. If it never happened, it feels a bit easier that way. And it's great imagery in there about like, there's a circle. I'm going to encapsulate what's going on. And I think that people sometimes can compartmentalize that well. And I think you did such a good job of saying, because there's some people that can constantly live the tragedy, and there are other people that put it in a box and just can say it's over here.
Absolutely. And that was actually one of the most interesting things I found when I was doing the research, is that, how perceptions of, how to help people who've been through traumatic events has changed. And a few years ago, it was all talk it out, and it was all therapy, and let's work through this. And then now the feeling's kind of shifted, and there's a sort of a school of thought that for a lot of people, the best thing is to let them form this protective shell, and actually rehashing, an event that was difficult for them is not the best way to recover. And it really, there's no right or wrong way. It really depends. And I think that's another thing that I'm really conscious of when I'm writing, is trying to think, this isn't about how I react or how I think someone should react. It's about how do I think this particular character react, given their background, what's happened to them, their age, their relationships. Like, what do I think would be maybe the course that they would follow? And that's different for everybody, really.
Because even Trish Gabby's mother, there's another young girl that died years ago, and she's steeply mourning her daughter's death. And at one point she comes up to Kieran and goes, enjoy your time with your little one. They grow up so fast if you're lucky. And you do, like, writing that grief into that, and the way she's still holding on. And I don't want to give away, but what she does in the book as an ongoing tribute or looking for her daughter is, it's just has being a mother changed how you even wrote that scene?
I think it definitely did. Yeah, I think inevitably. And when I wrote my first book, I wrote the first book before I was pregnant, and then by the time it was published, I was pregnant, and I had my first daughter, quite soon after. And it's funny because when I look back, there's things that not that I would change, but just that I could tell the sort of I guess perspectives that I have now that I didn't have when I wrote that first book. And it's not so much that I would go back in and change it, but I do think I'm sort of quite conscious, I guess, that I think you do think more in a different way about certain things, especially involving that relationship between parents and children. And I think as well, having sort of young children myself, and especially like I was saying with them being on the research trip and things, they're very sort of forefront of mind. I think inevitably, really, for like most parents.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're just like, oh, here's this little person. How would I react with this little person? It's completely different. As you just, I don't know, your whole lens changes after you have children.
That's it. It does, yeah.
And shortly after Kieran arrives, Bronte, a young woman working in the local bar, is found dead, which not only gets everybody focused on that crime, but the whole history comes back up, some of which many people have not, let go of. Was you always envisioned, like, there was going to be a crime that was based on another crime, or like there's something that happened years ago and we're repeating ourselves now? Or was that something you felt when you got out to Tasmania?
I do really like having kind of double strands in a book. I mean, I always try and write the kind of books that I like to read. And my favorite kinds of, mystery books, I guess, are the ones where there's a few layers going on. And part of the fun of it as a reader is kind of working out, how and if indeed they're intertwined. And so I always kind of try and I do always try and have a few different, I guess, questions to be answered through the books. And then it's just a question of, thinking about, the place is quite sort of a big part of like the inspiration behind like how is it going to play out and things. So, but ultimately it's just sort of thinking, as a reader, what would I like to happen in this story?
Well, all your books seem to feature sudden and mysterious death. So I feel like that's a Jane Harper signature right now. The person's there, we get to know her really well in the bar the next night, now she's dead. So you have this little bit of affinity for her because she's been this fabulous woman that, everybody wants to be. She's affable. She's chatting with everybody. She's the one that's in the water searching for the little girl's head on the beach, hat when it's lost on the beach, and then she's dead. Like, okay, we went full circle. We know her for this much, but we really care about her. So I don't know. So Tasmania's, I read, has got, in my deep research this morning of Tasmania that I knew nothing about, I actually thought it was on the coast of Australia. It has 1,000 wrecks around the island. Is it the rough waters there that cause wrecks to happen, or why do they have so many there?
Yeah, good question. And it's not one I'm totally know the answer. I think it's probably a combination of things. I think it is like the rough waters. I think it's probably also the route as well. Like that probably gets more than its fair share, or did, in the past, like it's of vessels actually trying to navigate those waters. So it's probably a bit of statistical, impact in there as well. But I thought that was a really fun fact. I mean, like having 1,000 shipwrecks, and this is not a huge sort of coastline either. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, this kind of graveyard for these sunken vessels, which is sort of kind of haunting image. And I think, you can't write a mystery book set in Tasmania and not make some reference to these wrecks kind of, just surrounding this place. And it's one of the few places in Australia you can go down and dive and see some of these sort of reasonably well-preserved vessels. So I thought that was a really fun element to include as well. But I didn't know anything about diving. I'm not a diver, and I've been like once on holiday in like the kind of tropical waters of Queensland. So as part of when I was down there doing the research, like I arranged to go diving with a company that kind of operates around one of these wrecks, and they took me down as far as I could go, given my limited experience. But I got that feeling of being in the water at that time of year. Like it's cold water there. It's you've got the sort of cold water wetsuits. Just the feeling of like what it's like breathing through the apparatus and mm-hmm. the kind of things you see, I guess. And, like I knew without doing that, I wouldn't have the kind of experience I needed to write that into the book. So that was a really important part of the research. And I learned a lot from it. It was really interesting to me to kind of get a chance to do that firsthand.
Were you terrified? Because I would be terrified going into water like that.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think it's one of those sports. It's either I think it's either for you or it's not for you. And I can the issue is I could see why the characters would like it. I could understand why people like it, because it is a completely, it's such a different experience. Like, you're so kind of weightless. It's not even like swimming. It's like this sort of surreal kind of otherworldly sort of feel, which I can understand people would like. For me, I was just like, having to focus really hard on like, not ripping off the mask, to be honest, because it's such an unnatural thing as well. But it was the first time I'd done it. I'm sure like, the more you do it, and I think the main thing was I could understand what people get out of it, which was kind of, I guess, what I was looking for, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there is that moment where you just have to breathe through the apparatus, and I think that's the part that throws me completely. I don't know, but
yeah,
there are a couple of interesting things from here. First of all, that you're going and doing this, but then think about these boats that are always sinking. And just remember, you flew and you said to your husband, you take the ferry over. You know what I mean? So it's like you experience what it's like to be on the boat. I'll be on the plane.
That's right. Yeah.
I got that right there. Okay. Yeah. And it's also interesting that in the summer, the people who are visiting are snorkeling and going out on adventure trips. They're actually paying the bills for everybody to live through the winter when these adventure trips come in, which they make you money, but really your bread and butter is these summer months. And I feel like that's another part of the seasonal town that people forget about is what's the other season activities. And for here, it's diving because you can't do it when there are that many people around. It'd be dangerous. Found that interesting too.
Yeah, and I think that's something that globally, really, a lot of tourist towns, whatever you may be, experience, and it's that sort of almost like love-hate relationship with the tourists, because you need them, and you absolutely need them to kind of come, and so you want them there, but at the same time, when they're there, kind of all you want is for them to leave as well, and then when they leave, it's sort of just kind of ghost town feel. So it's a real kind of I think that's something that anybody who's lived in a kind of area where it does have that kind of seasonal ebb and flow of the holidaymakers can recognize. I mean, I know even just from living in kind of the Bayside Melbourne, like we get that as well, like the real, coffee shops that, you're a welcome, known by name, customer in the winter months. In the summer months, you can't even get a seat, so is that sort of constant kind of wrestling with the benefit of the whole year round season, I guess.
Yeah. Well, right now, what we have in the States is a lot of people left the city, left New York, and went to their vacation homes wherever they are. So everybody who's used to these quiet little towns in March, they're back. Like they're not supposed to come back till May or June. They're back. And then in September, and they're not leaving. So one of my friends, my son's friends, was saying he was living up on Nantucket, and he couldn't get a Christmas tree because some people bought 7 for their very big house. And they said, you just bring a set number of trees onto the island. You don't really think about it. And now everyone's there year round. Everyone needs a turkey. Everyone needs, it was,
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this little town. If everybody stayed, it'd be like, oh, really? I can't get a seat at the bar. It's my turn.
Yeah, that's it. And it's those smaller, like those little domestic kind of anecdotes are so interesting as well, because I think those completely sum up better than any kind of population numbers or photos of like gridlock on Main Street or anything. It's those little anecdotes. Like for the first year, I couldn't get my turkey, I couldn't get my Christmas tree, and because you throw one thing out and a lot of things get thrown out. So it's quite interesting to hear that kind of stuff. I always find.
Yeah, these little, these little snippets. And those are the things that are really interesting. Everybody thinks about with lockdown X, Y, and Z, but then let's think about where the seismic shift has been. I forget how many people had their mail forwarded out of New York City over the last 9 months or 10 months at this point. And it was just this crazy number, but that's how you can see how people moved, because it's a change of address. It's quite simple. Cell phone, you don't get a new cell phone. You still have people are calling me and they're in New York, but their phone number is Michigan because that's where they grew up, but the address is the thing that's changed. There also these statues called the survivors at the beach. And I guess when the tide comes in, the survivors get underwater. So tell us about those. And did you actually see statues like that someplace?
Yeah, no. So that's one of the examples of, I guess, something, I like a fictionalized, but hopefully has that ring of truth that people sort of think, yes, I've seen things like that, or I've seen, I can imagine that in a town like that. I quite like to have a bit of a kind of a local focal point in the books. I had one in the Lost Man as well, which is set in outback Queensland. I had a lonely grave, which is what they call in the outback, where someone's died and they've been buried basically where they died, and it's a single grave in the middle of nowhere. And in this case, I had these sort of statues, which are a bit of a kind of I guess a tourist talking points, but for the locals are sort of very familiar. And the reason I kind of like to bring out something like that is because I think it sort of is believable to the area. Like I think we've all been to towns where they have those kind of something to put on the postcards, but also when you've got sort of something that's kind of an unmovable constant, it can tell you a lot about the characters by their relationship to things. So do they find it interesting because they're new to town? Do they not even notice them because they've been there their whole lives? Do they attach meaning to them that kind of reflects their own maybe personal lives, that kind of thing? So you can, when you've got like a constant element, it's quite a good way to sort of reveal things about the characters as well. So that's part of, I guess, the technical reason why I like to have something, I chose to have something like that in this book.
Yeah. And here I could just picture the water was getting higher. They should be out of the water. The statues, you almost can't see the top. It was this imagery that you knew you could see the statues full at other times. So you were definitely building tension, like tension just against this thing that was an inanimate object became a character. How's that?
Yeah, and the actual sort of structure of the statues, the inspiration probably came from two places. One that was near my house. There's a botanic gardens that has a statue of a man in a lake, and I walked past that a lot, particularly during lockdown. I saw that guy every day, you know, sitting there with his sort of sculpted, you know, and then there's an artist in the UK whose name, Gormley, I think his last name is. I'm sorry, it's completely escaped me in the moment. But he did a series of statues which were quite famous, which were life-size casts of his body, which he placed along the coastline. And you know, I think there's a lot of them, and they're really beautiful. Like they're quite sort of striking, and that's, you know, that's something that I remember seeing sort of years ago, and has really sort of stuck in my mind as such a kind of beautiful, kind of striking image. So those are probably, I guess, two things that kind of played into when I was thinking about what I'm going to do. Those are two things that kind of helped inspire that idea.
Yeah, and it definitely came across on the page. So so we talked a lot about location mattering to you. Okay. Do you know plot going in? Like when you got on the flight to Tasmania, did you know what the plot was going to be? Or were you going there to feel something and then know who your characters were and go from there?
So yeah, I definitely know the plot. Like I'm a big planner. And I know, it's every author has a different way of doing it, but my way is like, I always, so the plot comes first before anything else, really. I'm always thinking about the plot, and specifically actually about the endings. So I'm thinking about, that kind of moment as a reader when you turn a page and things are revealed. And you've got characters who've been brought to this, I guess, extreme moment, whatever it may be. And that's kind of when I'm planning a book, that's sort of the area I'm sort of thinking about most, really. And then I'm thinking about, well, what could bring people to this moment, and what characters would I need to kind of kind of tell out this story, I guess, and then where would it be set? And I'm sort of almost working backwards a little bit, like I'm building out from the ending. And then so even before I write anything, I will think about the whole thing. So beginning, a little bit in the middle, but beginning and end, certainly. I'll map it out in kind of this note form, and then I'll start building on that, and I'll build it out to the point where it's almost a chapter by chapter guide. And only really then, when I'm completely satisfied that that's how the structure should be, and I know that that's sort of the way I want to go, then I'll start writing it. Because I think for me, being able to sort of test things in a plan allows me to be more creative, because I can test 10 things. I don't have to commit to writing 10,000 words. I can just try out a few different things and see how it feels, and if it doesn't work, I can just delete that few sentences and start again. So that's kind of how I do it. So by the time I go on the research trip, I've probably got a full draft. And I know where the gaps in my knowledge are, but I've also got enough flexibility that I can change things depending on what I discover, because you always discover new things you didn't even know that you weren't aware of.
Yeah, it's like, wait, I didn't even know that was going to be important, but yes, it really is. And this is it's gonna shift the trajectory of the book just because I'm seeing this one thing, and it's gonna make it stronger. Yeah.
I mean, for example, one thing I didn't know when I went to Tasmania, I hadn't realised how few and far between the sort of the secondary schools were. So, for example, like how when you get to year 10, if you want to continue and finish high school, you have to get on that bus and go to the nearest kind of college to finish. Which is quite a big commitment. A lot of people maybe, they don't do it, so they have quite a high dropout rate for high school because of the physical, the geographical demands and things, and little things like that, which maybe don't play like a huge role in the book. But I think then when I learned that, I thought, well, actually, there's some characters here who would do that, and there's some characters who wouldn't, and that sort of changed the course of their personal stories a little bit.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time on the Outer Banks of North Carolina I think we went down there for somewhere, 16 years or something like that. And we met a lot of people who are local, and you'd hear about, like, the kids have to, like, there was a strip of water over here, the Sound. And for them to go to school, they had to go all the way around the island, like all around the other way. And you were just there like, really? Is there no? And they thought about putting a ferry across, and then you heard all the good parts and the bad parts about that. It would save us an hour getting there, but would more people come? It was just this really interesting thing because you only saw it from your perspective until you started talking to them and found out what living down there was really like and what it was. There are different challenges of living in a place where it's not everything is every single block. Like, you have to travel to go get places, and get things.
Yeah. I mean, one of the, it's the third book, The Lost Man, which was set in Outback Queensland, that was the biggest example of just like the absolute different lifestyle. I mean, with that, that was in absolute sort of far-flung kind of true outback. I had to get in like a tiny aircraft and had to drive with this retired officer for like 15 hours across the desert. And then when you get there and they, and it was everything from like, they had to have like food deliveries every 6 weeks, and the radios, like how they could communicate, and that played big parts of the story. Like, I mean, who could hear who on a radio? It turns out everybody, so things like that is a good example of something where that is quite a small fact, but it completely changes, especially when you're writing a mystery story. It makes a big difference if you can have a private conversation on a radio, or if it's open to everybody, so it's things like that you really want to make sure you get right before you kind of commit to 50,000 words on on this particular plot line.
Yeah, and this is what the people are doing. We're watching Yellowstone right now, and my favorite line is, "Take the chopper, it'll take too long in the car." And I just keep saying to my husband, like every time he goes to my sister, "Should we take the chopper? Will it take too long to get there in the car?" It's just such a great line, and it comes up. And last night there was something else. Oh, they had written something had happened out on the ranch, and the woman, the game warden, comes up and they go, "How far is it?" And they go, 3 hours. And I was like, 3 hours? Shouldn't they just take the chopper? Like, you're going to ride the horse for 3 hours. But it's giving you those little moments of hearing that line, which I repeat going, did they just say 3 hours? Is what gives you a much bigger picture of the book than just showing it from above and going, oh yeah, that's big. Then you're hearing, oh, it is kind of treacherous, the land to get there. It's not just like running around the racetrack. So what I feel like, you brought us into the place and I could feel the town. I could feel what it's like when the tide is coming in. If you don't predict it right, how you could get in trouble. And you built that tension up of the statues are getting deeper, this, and it definitely, you have that moment and you realize if you're in the town, you're used to it. But if you're not, you could really get in trouble quickly.
And I think that's such an important part of the writing is exactly as you say, trying to relate it in a way that people can understand in their own lives. You don't know what background knowledge and experience the readers are bringing to the book, so you need to give them something that they can relate to. So example, like if you show an overview, cinematically of a big farm, it doesn't really mean anything. But if you say the nearest town is 3 hours away, the nearest town is 3 hours away, or or we are, if you like anything that sort of shows people, I guess, where they can think, well, that's not what my life is like. Can you imagine having to drive 3 hours? Or can you imagine what it's like, being there, seeing this water to rising when it shouldn't be that high, and things. We've all kind of had little experiences, I think, and it's that you can kind of relate to, but it's trying to find those universal truths, I think, that the reader can then relate to.
Yeah, and the isolation and peril are two that you played very well in the book, because you're under the water, you're isolated, but also you're in peril. And the two of them are kind of married into this book of like biggest fears of people is, how am I going to get out of something that I can't really do myself? And then you drop into town a famous author named G.R. Barlin. So tell us about him and why you added him in, because what people are wondering why is there. And I'm wondering, was that fun for you?
Yeah, I did enjoy writing his character, and it's interesting because his, I always sort of like, I do plot out the characters beforehand and things, and but he was probably one who the characters sort of changed a little bit more than they usually do over the course of the book, because I think I did sort of feel more a bit of an affinity towards him in a way I hadn't sort of quite expected, I guess. So the reason really I chose to include him was because I think it's important when you have it was really, from a technical point of view, when you have a book, you want people to give the readers different perspectives. So it helps to have insiders and outsiders.
Mhm.
And then in terms of the outsiders, you want to think, what's the kind of their connection though with this place, and what would be a real reason for someone to move to this kind of small town and stay there year round. And there's quite a few reasons, but for me, I thought authors seeking a bit of like inspiration through a sea change seemed like something recognizable. Like we've heard about that, and we know people who've done that kind of thing. And I think also it gives him again like a different perspective on events. So he's coming in from a different background, education level, professional point of view, and he can give the reader sort of some insight into things that are going on that the other characters who are Dynawall locals maybe can't. So and then I guess the characters are always fictional, but I suppose for I suppose I did sort of feel like sometimes I felt a little bit close to him, I guess, in some other characters,
Yeah, bonding. But you know what? I'm soon betting, given your success, that people would be wondering why Jane Harper's in town. Like, is she writing a book based here? People are going to sit there and say, wait, this woman's here. What are we doing? What's going on? I mean, she's not going to always be in the outback. You pull into Tasmania again, they're sitting there going, ooh, we got to be on our best behavior. We might be in a book, You were a journalist before you started writing your first novel. What made you decide a thriller? Was it something you always loved reading, or you could have written anything?
Yeah. I mean, that was probably the primary reason. I'd always wanted to write a book. I just didn't know really what it was going to be about or what it was going to look like, and I never sort of found a time really around full-time work. It took me years to kind of realize that if I was going to do it, I was going to have to do it around my full-time job. I wasn't suddenly going to have this big block of time open up and this idea come to me. I was going to have to kind of try and, whittle away at it in small, hours here and there, really. So when I sort of decided to first write my first book, which was The Dry, I didn't really have any expectations for it. I'd sort of managed to let go of that, I guess that, the pressure that it would get published, because I think that held me back for a lot of years as well, thinking you have to invest all this time and effort and it might never get published, and will that feel like a complete waste? And eventually I sort of managed to realize that it wasn't, I wanted to do it enough that it didn't really matter if it didn't get published. I just wanted to do it so I could sort of feel like I'd at least tried, and maybe I'd learned something from that I could then use in the techniques I could use in future books, and maybe a future book might get published. So I was writing the first book with no expectations at all. And I thought, I'm just going to write something that I would enjoy. And I do enjoy books with a mystery. Like I said, I enjoy kind of, books with a few layers of questions as well. I wanted to write something set in Australia. I wanted to write something with characters that I felt people could engage with and felt authentic. So it was all just really written from me thinking, and there still are really, what if I was a reader picking this up, what would I like to get from this? But if I'd had an idea for something else, I guess it would have been something else, really. Like I wasn't I wasn't sort of totally committed to, I have to write kind of a crime mystery book. But I suppose those are the ones I was most familiar with in a way, and like I said, the ones I always like to read. So that's kind of how that decision was made.
I just tell you, there's so many people that I told I was interviewing you today. They go, you're interviewing Jane Harper, which made me feel total slacker that I came in on the fourth book. I mean, I have a very busy weekend ahead of catching up, seriously. Seriously, Linwood Barclay told me that being a journalist taught him to respect deadlines. He has this thing that he says, everybody says they have writer's block. He goes, if you're a plumber, you can't have plumber's block. Like teachers don't have teacher block. So you can't have writer's block. You have to go through it. What did being a journalist bring to you about deadline, craft, like nailing it, just sitting in the chair and nailing it?
Yeah, I actually agree with him on that completely. I mean, I think for sure, all those things, like the real technical stuff, like deadlines, like not being too afraid of like the blank page. I think what it really taught me was kind of like he said, there's always something you can do to try and work through it. It's like, it's okay, I think, to get stuck, but then you can't just throw your hands up and give up. You have to think, well, why am I stuck? Like, what is the problem here, or is the problem a few chapters back? You know, is it because I've made a mistake earlier on and now I've kind of hit the dead end? And so I do find there's always things you can kind of just try and unpick it, like, you know, follow your path back, see if there's something earlier on you can do to solve this present problem. Is it that this chapter isn't working? Sometimes I'll just drop that whole chapter and move on, and think I can always go back and, you know, reinstate it. Like I try and listen a lot to the red flags. So if I'm having to rewrite a section multiple times, or it feels like I'm really pushing it uphill, like now, particularly with each book, I've learned the earlier you listen to that red flag, the better. Because there's probably it's feeling hard because it's not right, and then I'll maybe take a step back. And, you know, it's absolutely fine as well, I think, to take thinking time. That's like that's never wasted time, you know, to think, just take a step back and think, you know, is this the right course? So you don't actually have to be physically writing to still be working on your book. So that's what I tend to do, like just try and think back to, you know, what you can actually do to sort of unpick the situation, so you don't feel like you're completely static. You're still working on it.
Yeah, and I think you just brought up something that's so interesting. It's not always about writing. Some people sit down and say you have to write 1,000 words a day or 2,000 words a day. But if you're still working on the book, if you're working the story through, even if it's just like, I'm stuck, let me go back and reread and see what to do. And I think that that's forgotten a lot, because it's about, it's like readers. I'm going to read 100 books this year, or I'm going to do X. It's like a goal. And I can understand that you want to get a certain amount accomplished and you don't want to slack. But at the same time, if you've got any kind of grit at just paying attention to what you're working on, reworking or rethinking is a huge part of what's going on. I used to love transatlantic flights for that reason. No email for like the whole time. Like, I'm never going to be the one that wants to have the internet on the plane, because you can actually think for the first time, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, there's a big difference between sort of being, you know, efficient and kind of busy work, you know, and that's something that, I mean, it can take a long time to kind of find that right balance for yourself. But I mean, for me, I mean, I would say I was working on the next book now, but I haven't written any of it. But I would say I've been working on it for several months, but it's all just been thinking. But for me, I know that is valuable time, and it saves me time in the long run. It means I'm not wasting loads of creative energy doing draft after draft after draft, thinking, oh, you know, why isn't this working? And then by the time you get the idea, you're exhausted and you've already written, you know, thousands of words. Like, I haven't written any words, but it means when I come to it, I'll still be fresh. I'll still have that enthusiasm. You know, I'm not burnt out from it. So, I mean, that doesn't work for everybody. Like, I noticed, you know, many successful authors who famously sit down and they just write, and, you know, you can't argue with that. But you know, there's no nobody cares how you write the book. Like, the readers don't care. They just care about the finished product. There's no medals for, you know, technique in terms of how you do it. No, you know, so you may as well just do what works for you, really.
Yeah, I mean, I read a book recently that will remain unnamed that was edited too many times. And what it needed was one person to just read it and say, this is not cohesive. Like, it's all really good. There are all these really good parts, but it's not cohesive, because you can see where you've picked it apart so many times that now you're like this and you're not like this. And sometimes it's because you've made so many changes, because where was the thinking up front? Like, where was it that, you know, you're sort of, and look, sometimes you're right and you get in the weeds. I mean, I get up sometimes and I have a whole plan for a day and I'm in the weeds, like, you know, 20 minutes in. So it does happen, but it's just kind of interesting that sometimes when I see something that's been rewritten, I can tell. Like, there's sometimes I can tell, and sometimes I can't. So is there?
And I think, like, trying to fight fires as well. Like, when you started something and it's that sunk cost commitment. You know, you've already. I feel for the author. I know how hard it is to delete tens of thousands of words, and you've made that commitment, and it's like, not everybody can do it, and I understand that, because it's a big. You know, you have to just grit your teeth and hit that delete button, and so I think, you know, but it's so hard as well when you kind of write yourself to corner. But that's why I also try and take that kind of big picture view and think about the ending right at the start, because my biggest fear is kind of getting to the last quarter of the book. I think, you know, actually, this is such a great mystery. it seems unsolvable, because it is unsolvable. Like, I guess there's no solution. So that is like my biggest kind of professional fear. So I always make sure that I know even how kind of the main character is going to kind of solve it roughly. Like, I have a bit of an idea about how they can kind of make that connection in their mind that's going to lead them to the resolution and things, because I just don't want to like take myself into that corner.
Yeah, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm there, and how did I get here? And this is not good. And the deadline's tomorrow, you know? Is there a big writing community in Australia, and do you network with each other? Because I know some authors, and I know a few authors in Australia, you know, like I'm talking like I'm, you know, bon vivant or something like that. But is there a big writing community? Like, do you get together? Are there conferences there?
There is, I mean, yeah, I mean, that the Australian writer community, I think, is really supportive of each other, which is really good. And there's a lot of really great festivals that happen every year. So Sydney Writers Festival, Melbourne Writers Festival, actually Perth, Adelaide, they all have them. And there's a lot of smaller regional ones, and then more specific ones as well. So you do tend to kind of cross paths quite a lot. I think, I mean, like you're saying, often sometimes as well, because a lot of us, not everybody by any means, but a lot of us are kind of centrally, like in maybe located in Melbourne or Sydney. So we were talking earlier about Sally Hepworth, who's a really great Australian author. If you like, you know, that kind of Liane Moriarty type, you know, kind of domestic noir with an edge, you know, she's a really, you know, great writer to discover if you haven't come across Sally Hepworth yet. I think you know, it's really nice when, you know, authors kind of I think it's nice for authors to know other authors, because it means, yeah, it's quite a solitary activity, I think, and you spend a lot of time alone. So yeah, it's but this has been great as well, having, I think nowadays with Zoom and things, having the opportunity to do events with authors who are from elsewhere as well, and, you know, get a different perspective on the writing process.
And you don't have to get on a plane for 24 hours. You don't have to do these long flights, you know, So The Drive, Forces of Nature, The Lost Man, and Now Survivors have all been big successes. Does that put pressure on you to write, or do you just, like, do you sit there and go, I do next? Do you feel that way?
Oh, you know, it does change your perspective a little bit. I guess with each book, you know, you're more aware that the people are looking out for it. Well, with the first book, nobody knows or cares you're working on anything. So it does, you are a bit more aware of the audience. But at the same time, I've actually done a short TEDx talk about this, if anybody's interested in a kind of slightly longer version of this answer, but about I think about controlling sort of the things you can control within a creative process, because you can't control really what's going to happen to a book, you know, how it's going to be received, and what the reviews are going to say, and, you know, how well it's going to sell, even, you know, I mean, all it takes is one pandemic, and, you know, all the metrics are thrown out of the window. All you can really control is doing, I think, the best job you can do. And that is about, you know, sort of finding a writing technique that works for you, being consistent, finding that time, trying to find those ways to do that kind of, you know, writer's block type situations if you find yourself in them, and doing a book that you feel that you know you can be proud of, and you've put in the time. At the end, when it's published, there's nothing more. I know there's nothing more I could bring to those books. I've done everything I can. I did the research, I did the work, I put the time in, and I think at that point, that's quite freeing to sort of think that, because whatever happens next, it happens. But I know I did everything I could do.
And I think that's a lot of it. It's like I put myself out on the page. You know, I had a number of author friends who didn't have a book in 2020, and they were all lamenting they did not have a book come out last year. And in about June, I wrote, I said, still sad about that? Are you still unhappy that nothing's coming out this year? I don't think that's too big a problem right now. I think it's a good thing. So have you had, and I have to confess, I did not look at this. Have you been a book a year since The Dry?
I did three. I did three in succession, and then I had, and then The Survivors was. Now I'm on every other year, mainly because I mean, book a year is actually quite a grueling pace, and especially with having young kids as well. It was just, it's better for me to have a little bit more time to kind of be able to do the trips and things, and have a bit more sort of thinking time and stuff. So that this is like a better pace for me going forward with the kids.
Well, you know what it is too, because you're promoting around the world. Like the book has already been out in Australia. The book is already out in England. So you're constantly on tour. Like the tour doesn't just be the US tour. There's a much larger, and it was interesting because so many people, because of Zoom right now, we're doing all of Europe or all of this or all of that, which you normally, the publishers weren't all going to take you wherever you were going to go. You'd go maybe for one of the books, not for all of them. But now it's like the promotion period has gone like this instead of being confined to just a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I try and I do try and like really ring fence the writing time and things as well. So I'll do events that are kind of I know are worth doing and get good audience and have good engagements and things. But yeah, there comes a point where you have to sort of and the publishers are already supportive of this as you would expect. As well, they want you to write, but to make sure you've got that quiet time as well, where you can just focus specifically on the books.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. So the film based on The Dry has aired in Australia. Will we see it in the States?
I hope so. Yeah, it's the distributors are in talks with so the producers are in talks with international distributors about the best way to hopefully get it out. It's a really superb film. They've done a really amazing job about adapting it. I think they've captured the book in a really beautiful way. I personally couldn't be happier with it. It was written and directed by a guy called Robert Connolly, who's an Australian director, and stars Eric Bana as Aaron Falk, they've just done a superb job. So hopefully you guys get to see it sooner rather than later.
That'd be great. Is The Survivors destined for the screen as well?
Yeah, hopefully it is. It's being optioned for a TV series. That's early days yet, but yeah, it's in really. And I'm excited to see what could happen. Having seen how well The Dry has come together, how well it's been received by audiences, and what a beautiful job they've done with that. It makes me really excited to see what could be done with The Survivors. So yeah, watch this space. More news to come on that, hopefully.
I'm thinking of how it could be in bites. I'm thinking of how the episodes could work, if break up well. So was The Survivors always the title?
I tend to come to titles quite late. I sort of write the book first, and then I sort of think about what could fit. So it was one that came, in terms of when I first started thinking about it, was one that came very early on. Yeah. And I think was always the sort of the natural fit for it. So I didn't really go through too many different options in my head. But the title is also something I tend to kind of get the story out first, and then I think what would be a good title for this one.
Yeah, it's book 4 for a long time. It's book 4 is set in Tasmania. Yeah. Tasmanian 4. And you definitely get the ruggedness of the coast. You get the fact that you're really in the middle of nowhere. It definitely is evoked on the cover. They did a good job. I really, felt that.
It looks beautiful.
Was this the first stab of the cover in the US, or did they have other looks for this?
No, it was. Well, that was the only one they sent me, and they really loved it, and I thought it was beautiful. Like, I was completely happy with to just sign off on that one straight away. So I think everybody was we thought that was a really a really good image to kind of sum up the book and kind of hopefully draw people into the story. Yeah,
even the way the words pale and whatever. Have you listened to the audio? Have you listened to the audiobook?
I haven't listened to the audio of this one, but I've listened to the audio of all the others, because they're always done by the same narrator, who's a guy called Steve Shanahan, who is such a great narrator. He's this Australian actor. He's done all the books. We specifically asked for him now, and I think he enjoys doing them. So it's a really happy sort of partnership there, and he does a great job of he really brings him to life in such a good way. So I'll definitely, I will be listening to the audio of this one. Because I think for me, it's interesting. The audio version is it's such a fresh way for me to experience it. So I do like to have a little listen. Maybe honestly, I usually listen on a plane. I haven't been on a plane for a whole year, so it's so that's probably why I haven't got around to listen to the whole 8 hours of this one yet.
I'm missing my car time. People were saying, what is different today? And I'm like, the difference is I'm not in a car listening to things or calling my friends, because I only call people from the car. So I'll have to go sit in the driveway or something, because I don't go anywhere anymore. So, because I listened to a snippet of the audio, and I thought he was dead on perfect. I thought the voice was absolutely terrific. So you're in the process of thinking about something that will come in 2 years. Is that what we're hearing?
Yes, I'm still in the early stages. I'm still kind of weighing up a few ideas. Like I said, I like to kind of really test things out before I totally commit. So I'm weighing a few things, but it's safe to say next book it'll be another Australian mystery, very sort of same sort of tone and feel, I think, of the other ones. So if you enjoy the other ones, I think this will be very much in that vein. But it'll be a new setting, and yeah, and like and you know, hopefully a few good sort of twists and turns along the way and things.
Yeah, well, I look forward to it. Wait, just one question before you go though. You grew up in the UK. You were born in the UK, correct? Have you ever thought about setting something there?
I have, well, I wouldn't say, like, never say never, really. I think, you know, the setting is a really important part of the story. So if I had an idea that lends itself to the UK, I would absolutely sort of consider that. And so far, all the books I've had have been very Australian centric, and that's kind of what I'm happy sort of writing about at the moment. But yeah, we'll see. I always try and let the best ideas rise to the surface. So if I had a good idea that lends itself there, I definitely would consider it.
Well, if people always ask me, where would you like to go most? And I've always said Australia, New Zealand. And reading your books has only made me want to do that more. So it's just that long flight. There needs to be a little stop in the middle of the water, you know, Hawaii maybe on the way or something, but I definitely would love to do that. And you just made me want to do it more. I thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to go catch up on the last 3 books as my homework.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. This has been really lovely talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And to our readers, we look forward to seeing you next time.